Time use surveys collect information on how people allocate their time among different types of activities during the day and provide a detailed picture of people's daily lives. In gender statistics, time use surveys represent a useful source of information for investigating how women and men divide their time between paid work, housework, study, personal care, family tasks, and leisure activities. In showing the different patterns of time allocation associated with gender, time use surveys highlight roles and conditions of women and men in family and social life. In this presentation, we will see why time use surveys are useful, what type of time use data are available, what data collection methods and classification systems for the coding of activities are used, and what the measurement issues specific to time use surveys are.
Why should information on time use be collected? More traditional statistical sources, such as labour force or enterprise surveys, only cover activities associated with paid work. These sources don't cover unpaid work, which includes non-remunerated activities such as household work, childcare, or volunteer work. One of the greatest values of time use surveys is that they shed light on unpaid work. From a gender perspective, it is crucial to collect information on the time devoted to non-market work, since the contribution of men and women to such activities is not equal. For example, time use surveys show that women spend in general more time on unpaid work rather than on paid work. Moreover, in many countries, women work on average more than men when unpaid work is taken into account. It is only through time use surveys that a full picture of the respective contribution of men and women to the welfare of households and society can be depicted.
When data from time use surveys are available, the value of unpaid work can also be estimated in monetary terms within the household satellite accounting, which is produced separately but consistently with the system of national accounts. In this framework, it is possible to assess the contribution of unpaid work, such as volunteer work and other household activities, and highlight the respective role of women and men. The economic value of unpaid work is high. For example, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the ratio of the value of unpaid work to Australia's GDP in 1997 ranged from 43% to 62%, depending on the valuation method used. According to Statistics Estonia, the value of unpaid work in Estonia in 1999 to 2000 ranged from 27% to 58% of GDP. In Korea, in 1999, it ranged between 30% and 53% of GDP.
Many countries have conducted time use surveys in recent years. For example, 21 European countries have carried out such surveys, as well as Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, and at least as many other countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Here is an example using data published by Eurostat. On average, in 15 European countries, women aged 20 to 74 spend much more time than men on domestic work, ranging from around 50% more in Sweden to over 200% more in Italy and Spain. From the graph, it is clear that in most countries, men spend on average more time on gainful work than on domestic tasks, whereas the opposite is true for women. If we look at the total hours worked per day, the total length of the bars, in most countries, women work on average more than men. This is true also in other regions of the world. For example, the time use survey carried out in the Republic of Korea has found that on average women spend 21 hours more than men per week in unpaid work, and their total working week exceeds men's by almost an hour a day.
It should be kept in mind that the time spent on work or other activities is an average over all persons, including persons who are not employed, and over the whole year, including weekends and holidays. This explains why the time spent on gainful work is significantly less than a normal working day. In fact, the average day, which comes out of time use surveys, does not look like anyone's typical day. An interesting use of time use data is to look at how homogeneous groups of people spend their time. For example, employed men and women. As the graph shows, employed women spend much more time daily on domestic work than employed men. For example, in Italy, employed women, after the working time in the office, spend another 4 hours on domestic work, while employed men just 1 hour. Other analyses can be made, for example, comparing the work times and time allocation patterns of single and married women and men with and without young children, or to look at weekdays and weekends separately.
Another important topic on which time use surveys shed light is the reconciliation of work and family life. Demands of family life often impose limits on employment, especially for women who do most of the unpaid work and who often find it difficult to balance time spent in paid work with family time and free time, such as the need to relax or exercise. Thanks to time use surveys, it is possible to study the division of labour within the household and to find out to what extent there is shared responsibility for care of children and the elderly, as well as for the various tasks related to household work. In some surveys, interviewees are also asked about how satisfied they are with the use of their time, how they perceive their quality of life, and whether they experience any feelings of time stress.
For example, a comparison of data from time use surveys carried out in 1986 and 2005 by Statistics Canada showed that women, in general, do most of the housework and tend to feel more time stressed than men do. However, things appear to be changing in recent times. Now, more men are juggling household chores and paid work duties, while women are spending more time at the office. As a result, the gap between men and women in the division of labour is still there, but it is slowly getting narrower, as can be seen from the graph. On the work-life balance, Statistics Canada notes that in couples where both partners work full-time and who have dependent children at home, only 52% of women felt satisfied with their work-life balance. In contrast, 71% of their male counterparts were satisfied. This suggests that women face more challenges in finding the right balance between work and family, especially because of the heavier burden posed on their shoulders in terms of household-related tasks.
Another way of using the information provided by time use surveys is by looking at various participation rates rather than average number of hours spent on activities. The participation of women and men to specific types of activities is an important indication of their role in the family and the society. Using the same example from Canada, the proportion of men aged 25 to 54 who did some housework daily, whether it was making lunch, vacuuming, or taking out the garbage, rose from 54% in 1986 to 69% in 2005. The participation rate for women remained steady at around 90%.
Time use surveys are also useful in improving estimates of paid work by collecting accurate data on some categories of paid work which are not covered sufficiently using traditional labour force surveys, such as atypical work situations, informal employment, and casual work. Additional sources of work hours, such as work done at home and while travelling, and children's work. For example, in Mongolia, the 2000 time use survey showed that 37% of children aged 12 to 15 are engaged in work. It is also possible to study how working hours are distributed along the day of men and women in order to understand how paid work interacts with other activities such as care of children or the elderly.
Time use surveys are also a useful tool to collect information on activities undertaken during free time and the lifestyles of men and women. They may help to study such different topics as leisure activities, volunteer work, use of public services, and use of television and the internet. Through the information on time spent with relatives or friends, it is also possible to map the social networks of individuals. To better illustrate the differences, these two graphs compare time use by men and women in Spain and Latvia on the amount of time spent daily watching television and video and on domestic activities. As we see, in both countries, women spend more time on domestic activities than watching television, while men in both countries, on average, spend slightly more time on TV and video than domestic work.
As we have seen, there are various reasons for collecting data on time use. We will now look into how such data are usually collected. Time use data are collected through a household survey on a sample of randomly selected people. In general, the basic time use data are collected through a self-administered time diary, typically covering 24 hours of 1 or 2 randomly selected days. Sometimes each person is asked to complete a diary for 1 weekday and 1 weekend day. Additional background information on characteristics such as sex, age, education, and household composition is also collected through individual and household questionnaires. Sometimes a weekly diary is also used for further information on paid work patterns. Other common methods are the interview, in which respondents are asked to recall their activities on the previous day, and the participant observation method.
In general, time use surveys collect information on the context of activities, such as where, with whom, and for whom or for what purpose people conduct an activity. Activities that take place in parallel should be recorded and prioritised as main and secondary activity. For example, childcare is often a secondary activity. Having data on secondary activities will make it possible to know the totality of time mothers or fathers spend with their children and the extent to which women and men juggle multiple activities at the same time. An important choice to be made when designing a time diary is whether to use a full diary or a light diary. In the full diary or open diary, activities and their context are described by the respondent in his or her own words, as shown in the example of a full diary used in Estonia. These activities are then coded to a detailed activity classification. It is vitally important for the reliability of the estimates that coders are accurate and consistent in their coding. In light diaries, or pre-coded diaries, respondents choose one out of a limited set of predefined activity categories. Such diaries require fewer resources than full diaries, but produce less detailed data sets. However, it may be more appropriate for respondents with low literacy levels. Here is an example of a pre-coded diary used in Oman in their time use survey of 1999.
Another decision to be made when designing a time diary is whether to use an open interval for reporting activities, where each person records the beginning and end of every activity described, or a fixed interval of time, for example 5, 10, 15 or even 30 minutes have been used. Eurostat suggests using 10-minute intervals. Pilot surveys in Italy and Sweden showed that open intervals underestimated the number of activities reported. 5-minute intervals induced respondents to report unimportant activities, such as opened the door, and 15-minute intervals induced excessive aggregation.
Whatever type of diary is used, a comprehensive activity classification is needed so that all activities can be classified appropriately, and activities mainly undertaken by women should be represented as adequately as those mainly undertaken by men. The classification should be consistent with the analytical objectives of the survey and with existing classifications of labour and economic statistics. Many countries follow the guidelines and use the classification of activities recommended by the United Nations and Eurostat. This ensures international comparability. The United Nations produced a trial international classification of activities for time use statistics in 1998, sometimes referred to as ICA-TUS. This classification comprises 363 activity subclasses organised in a hierarchical structure. In 2005, the UN published a guide to producing statistics on time use, aimed at facilitating the harmonisation of data collection methods, which also included the classification of activities. Eurostat published guidelines for harmonising European time use surveys in 2000, with suggestions on sample design, survey forms, required metadata, and an activity coding list which corresponds quite closely to the UN classification.
We will now look briefly into some measurement issues which are specific to time use surveys. Due to increasing interest in how children and older people spend their time, special attention needs to be given to the coverage of the survey, such as age cut-offs and types of dwellings covered. Children and collective dwellings, such as old age homes, are usually excluded from household surveys. Furthermore, different age cut-offs in different countries can affect international comparability. For example, age cut-offs range from age 3 in Italy up to age 20 in Sweden. To deal with this problem, Eurostat recommends including children from age 10 or at least from age 15 in the time use surveys.
To take into account seasonal variations and variations in the activities undertaken on different days of the week, surveys should ideally be conducted continuously, or otherwise in several periods over the year, and diaries should be distributed evenly throughout the days of the week. No changes to the days assigned for timekeeping by respondents should be allowed.
Keeping a time diary can be quite time-consuming for respondents. In order to obtain reliable data, it is important to encourage cooperation by illustrating the importance of the survey and guaranteeing confidentiality. It is also important to provide detailed instructions and to give examples of how to record activities in the diaries. Graphics and layout should not be overlooked.
As we have seen, there are a number of methodological challenges that should be taken into consideration when designing the time use surveys. These include collecting main as well as secondary activities, deciding on full or light diaries, deciding on the coverage of the survey, taking into account seasonal variations and variations in the activities undertaken on different days of the week, and following the International Classification of Activities.
In conclusion, we can say that studying the time allocation patterns of various daily activities provides extremely precious information on conditions of life of women and men, on economic and social constraints posed on them, as well as on their social networks. From a gender perspective, time use surveys provide valuable information for gender statistics, as they highlight how much unpaid work is carried out by women compared to men, make it possible to study the division of labour within the household and to find out to what extent there is shared responsibility for childcare and the various tasks related to family work, draw attention to the changing roles and conditions of women and men in family and social life, cover some atypical cases of paid work which are usually not included in the traditional labour force surveys.